Beheadings, riots, and escalating threats. Is the Middle East Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran about to turn hot? I'm Mehdi Hasan, also on the show. As aid finally reaches the besieged Syrian town of Madaya, I'll ask a top Human Rights Watch official about the horrific use of starvation as a weapon. But first, the execution of leading Shia cleric Nimr al-Nimr by the Saudi authorities, followed by the burning of the Saudi embassy in Tehran, has led to a new and dangerous standoff between the kingdom and the Islamic Republic of Iran. But which of these two countries is to blame for the rising tensions? I'm joined from Princeton University by Syed Hussein Mousavian, the former head of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Iran's National Security Council, and a close ally to the country's President Hassan Rouhani. And from Jeddah by Jamal Khashoggi, former advisor to Saudi Prince Turki Al-Faisal, who says Saudi Arabia and Iran are like fire and dynamite in one room. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me here in the arena. Let me begin by asking you both, are your two countries, which are now locked in this escalating war of words, this diplomatic tit for tat, closing down embassies, banning flights, are your two countries holding the region and the wider Muslim majority world hostage to your own rivalry, to your own struggle for power in the Middle East? Jamal Khashoggi.
Yes, we are. But of course, each one of us going to blame the other. How did this all happen? It all happened because of a simple reason: Iranians' expansionism. It is not the age of empire buildings anymore. It is the age of independent state, sharing borders, sharing respect, Westphalias, and that's what we need from Iran. If the Iranians behave in the region like Turkey, like Pakistan, they would be very much welcomed. We would be doing business together. But Iranians are sending militias to Iraq, to Syria, participating in the killing of innocent Syrians. It's all about expansionism, not about anything else.
Syed Hussein Mousavian, Iranian expansionism, says Jamal Khashoggi. That's what's led us to this point.
First of all, I don't believe Iranian government is after escalation of tension with Saudi Arabia. Everyone knows after Rouhani's election, Tehran approached many times to have direct negotiation with Riyadh on different issues. Where and why the problem starts really from the Iranian point of view is very different with what my friend Jamal says. It was known to Iranians, many Europeans, they told us during 2003 to 2005 that Saudis, they don't want peaceful solution on nuclear, they just want us to attack Iran. All Saudi angry is because of the nuclear deal. Clearly they were after creating a war on nuclear issue. Now Saudis are very worried about possible US-Iran rapprochement.
Jamal Khashoggi, it's less about the Syrian civil war. He says more about the fact that you object to the Iranian nuclear deal. Saudi Arabia doesn't want Iran being brought in from the cold.
Yes, of course. We don't want an aggressive Iran with nuclear power or free of sanction because of they are aggressive, not because they want a nuclear power. Our friends, the Pakistanis, have acquired the nuclear power, and we are not wary of them. But of course, we are wary of the Iranians when we see their militias chanting in the mosque of Aleppo and Homs and taking pride in the killing of people there in Iraq. That is something to worry.
First of all, Iran really believes the major threat to peace, security, and stability in the Middle East, in the region, is the rise of terrorism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, Boko Haram.
Yes,
and
that's
there
true,
is now a very clear
them.
understanding internationally, Jamal, that Saudi Arabia and Saudi allies, they have a lot to do as the source of fund, source of weapon, and source of ideology to this extreme terrorism. This is number one. Second, Iran believes Syrian government was and is legal government of Syria, has representative United Nations, recognized by United Nations as a legal government in Syria.
Sayyid Hussein Mousavian, let me ask you this. You point out that the world now is looking at Saudi Arabia's role in the rise of extremism, terrorism. That's undeniable. There is much more debate about that. But a lot of people in the Middle East are also saying, well, Iran is partly to blame for sectarianism because of the Syrian civil war. You look at what the Assad regime has done there in the killing of hundreds of thousands of people with Iran supporting him. Do you accept that Iran has also played a role in sectarianizing the region thanks to the Syrian war?
See, if there was not a weapon, money, and support for terrorists in Syria like ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Syrian crisis could be managed very soon at the early days. Of course, Assad made a mistake to react very angrily, brutally against the demonstrations in 2011. There is no doubt.
Jamal.
All right, first of all, Saudi Arabia did not send a single dime to ISIS or to Jabhat al-Nusra. We see them as terrorists. We are fighting them. We beheaded 44 of them just a week ago. So no way anybody can accuse Saudi Arabia of supporting or tolerating ISIS as much as the Iranians and Bashar al-Assad did in Syria. They need ISIS. They need ISIS to justify their presence.
But you have been accused of funding extremist groups, if not ISIS. You have been accused of funding other groups, haven't you? Hillary Clinton said so in a US cable.
Yeah.
She said Saudi Arabia is the number one source of donations for quote-unquote Sunni jihadist groups.
Saudi private money, and we are suffering from that, and we are after every single penny. But the Saudi government is a fierce opponent to terrorism and radicalism, and it is being appreciated by the international community. But Iran is supporting a dictator.
You say that the international community appreciates Saudi's role in fighting ISIS. A lot of people in the West these days, politicians, journalists, diplomats, government ministers, are looking at Saudi Arabia and its beheadings, its treatment of women and minorities, and they're saying openly, we don't see that much difference between Saudi and ISIS. It's a point the New York Times editorial board made just last month. What do you say to them? It must worry you that people are saying that openly now.
No, execution is an execution. To hang people from a crane or to behead them with a sword, it is execution. It is brutal. But what we are doing in Saudi Arabia is we are doing that through judiciary, and we are only targeting terrorists or dissidents who are calling for violence. But we are not executing political prisoners.
Human rights groups have deemed Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, this Shia cleric who was executed on January 2nd alongside a bunch of other Al-Qaeda type people. They have said he was a political prisoner, and that's what's kicked off this current crisis. Do you think Saudi Arabia wanted this crisis? Did the Saudi authorities execute him knowing it would create this backlash?
Nimr al-Nimr called for a foreign power to take part, to be in charge of Saudi Arabia, and that is a major treason.
So you behead a non-violent political protester?
We also beheaded many non-violent Al-Qaeda members. They had no blood in their hand, but they called for violence.
Did he call for violence?
We are applying this law
because Amnesty International, other groups say he didn't call for violence.
Yes, Nimr called for violence.
That's not what the human rights groups say. Let me just bring in Sayyid Hussein Mousavian. What do you say to people who say, hold on, how can Iran criticize Saudi over executions when Iran is the only country in the Middle East which executes more people than Saudi Arabia, globally only second to China in terms of executions?
First of all, Iran criticizing of the recent execution because it was executing the leader, religious leader of minority of Shia. in Saudi Arabia. It was really a big deal. It was really provocative.
When you talk about provocation, it wasn't just Ayatollah Khamenei who reacted quite hyperbolically, saying that there would be divine vengeance against Saudi Arabia, but President Rouhani said some pretty bombastic things about Saudi crimes on Twitter too. He's a good friend of yours. You're a close ally of his. Is he the pragmatist that we've been led to believe he is, or does he want confrontation
Mehdi,
as much as anyone else?
Look, Mehdi, Rouhani is pragmatist because immediately after assault of Saudi embassy in Tehran, first of all prominent Iranian authorities, they immediately condemned, from the head of judiciary, the head of parliament, president, even the commander of Revolutionary Guard. Second, immediately they have arrested 60 people during last days. Everybody unanimously has condemned the assault of against Saudi embassy.
How do you both propose to end this crisis? Do either of you have a solution?
The Iranians must get out of Syria, must get out of Iraq, sit with Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Pakistan, and let's work out a plan for a better Middle East.
And how worried?
That is the solution.
Okay, how worried should the rest of the world be about an open military confrontation? Not a proxy war like Syria or Yemen, but an open confrontation between Saudi and Iran.
They should be worried. They should be worried because each country doesn't want war. Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Deputy Crown Prince, de-escalate, and he said we don't want war, but the proximity, the closeness, we are right next to each other, the hate, the anger, the killing, yes, they have the ingredients for a major confrontation. When you have militias fighting on behalf of Iran, and not only on behalf
of Saudi,
and Iranian militias, that is too close, which could lead to a war.
Sayyid Hussein Mousavian, do you agree? Should we be worried about an open war between the two countries that there isn't a resolution?
No, I don't believe we should be worried. I don't believe there will be a war. We have to understand we need diplomacy like what we did on Iranian nuclear crisis. I mean, the way is for Iran and Saudi Arabia to have immediate direct negotiations on security issues, bilateral security issues, regional security issues, and try to help to resolve the problem.
Jamal Khashoggi, if your friends in the Saudi royal court came to you and said, should we sit down with the Iranians around the table, have direct talks with no preconditions, would you say yes, go for it?
No, we need the Iranians to act. Hussein is talking peace and acting war. Iranians must get out. They must get their militias out of Syria as a goodwill. Then we can sit with them and talk peace and try to bring peace and security back to Syria. But they are fighting right now, as we speak right now, the three of us. Iranians militias are fighting in
Syria already. International community have agreed what to do on Syria.
Let me ask you this: how worried are you about the sectarianism that has come out of the rivalry between your two countries that's now spreading across the Muslim-majority world? The sectarianism, the Shia-Sunni war that everyone's talking about, as a direct result of the confrontation between your two countries.
Sectarianism is a tool of the conflict and a result of the conflict. The Iranians act in a sectarian way. They stand by a dictator because he's from the same sect. They fought with the Houthi because from the same sect.
And the Saudis don't do the same? The Saudis don't do the same?
Sectarianism.
Really? The Saudis didn't do the same in Bahrain?
Of course not.
The Saudis didn't do the same when you went into Bahrain on behalf of a Sunni king?
No, not at all. The Saudi went to Bahrain because the Bahraini government needed help, not because of
That's exactly what the Iranians say about
the
Syria.
Shia of Kuwait.
You both sound like each other when you talk about Syria and Bahrain.
No.
It's ironic.
Look, it is immoral. It is immoral to compare Bahrain to Syria. 300,000 people were killed in Syria.
I'm not comparing the death tolls. I'm comparing the language that is used and the sectarian angles that are used in this conflict. And I'm saying, are Muslims around the world? Do you think they're tired? Both of you. Do you think Muslims around the world are tired of this spat between your two countries that is affecting the entire Muslim majority world?
Of course, we are all tired of that, but we are not fighting along sectarian lines.
There's plenty of Saudi preachers. There's plenty of Saudi preachers, Jamal, as you know, who would say some pretty awful things about Shias, Christians, Jews, Alawites.
Look,
you know that, I know that.
We got look. We got our crazes. The Iranians got their crazes, but we are talking about government to a government. We are talking about international politics here, not about a Saudi preacher or an Iranian zealot. We are talking about what Saudi Arabia is doing. Saudi Arabia is supporting peace and freedom in Syria and Yemen and fighting dictatorship, while the Iranians are standing with the dictators.
Jamal, frankly speaking, no one in the world would buy your claim that Saudi Arabia is for democracy. I would say the conflict between Shia and Sunni is a very important issue. We have to take it serious. Iran is playing a leading role on Shia world. Saudi Arabia is playing a critical role on Sunni world. Therefore, Iranian government, Saudi government, and Iranian clerics, Saudi clerics, they need to sit and to have a dialogue and to cooperate together to prevent conflict between Shia and Sunni.
Let's leave it on that note. Thank you both, gentlemen, for joining me in the arena. Am I the only one fed up with all the stereotypes about Latin America? Think Mexico, think cartels, think Brazil, think corruption, think Colombia, think cocaine. Sorry, but what a load of nonsense. For starters, Latin America covers 20 countries with more than 500 indigenous languages, so it makes no sense to lump them all into one narco-trafficking, AK-47 toting, Spanish-speaking, tortilla-eating, sombrero-wearing group. Yet prejudice abounds. The region can't seem to shake off outdated images of tin pot dictators and military juntas, despite the fact that 19 out of the 20 countries in Latin America today are democracies. Sorry, Cuba. Oh, and when Latin American nations were run by generals, they tended to be propped up by the United States, that beacon of liberty and democracy next door. And look, today the region does have the dubious distinction of being the most violent place on earth. But it's not all a hotbed of death and destruction. Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, they all have roughly similar homicide rates to the US, nor is it an ungovernable hellhole that everyone's trying to escape. In fact, there are now more Europeans emigrating to Latin America than the other way around, while Mexican immigration into the US has been sharply declining for a while now. So Donald, you know what you can do with that wall of yours. Look, no one will deny that there's a huge problem with inequality or poverty, but Mexico and Brazil are on course to becoming two of the world's biggest economies. 1 out of every 3 Latin Americans is already a member of the global middle class. And as recently as 2013, the world's richest person was Mexican telecoms tycoon Carlos Slim. Let's not forget either the more than a dozen Nobel Prizes for chemistry, medicine, peace, and of course, literature. And while France, Russia, China, the US all wait for their first female president, Latin Americans have had 9 of them. Equality also extends to same-sex marriage, legal in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. What about the so-called American dream? Rags to riches, anyone having a chance to make it to the top. Remember when President Obama told us,
"In no other country on earth is my story even possible."
Tell that to Bolivian President Evo Morales, who went from poor farmer to president, or former Brazilian President Lula da Silva, who went from being a shoe shiner to leading his country, or the former bar bouncer and janitor from Argentina, who became the first non-European pope in 1200 years. Rest assured, the American dream, the Latin American dream, is well and truly alive. The United Nations says 400,000 people in Syria are trapped in areas besieged by either the government, rebels, or other armed groups. This week, aid finally reached the town of Madaya, where residents had been literally starving to death. Joining me now to discuss this from New York is Sarah Leah Whitson, Executive Director of the Middle East and North Africa Division for Human Rights Watch. Sarah, thanks for joining me on UpFront. We're hearing reports of residents in Madaya having been forced to eat the city's stray cats and dogs. Such has been the level of starvation brought about by a brutal 6-month-long siege. UN investigators are now debating whether it's a war crime or even a crime against humanity. What's your view on that issue? And is the Assad regime and its allies 100% responsible for it?
Well, the Assad regime is 100% responsible for the siege in Madaya and a number of other places that it has barred from allowing aid in and people to leave out. Of course, these are not the only besieged areas in Syria. Islamic State is holding people hostage. Other armed groups have besieged areas and are similarly depriving the civilian population of aid.
There are two towns, aren't there, that are also controlled nearby by government loyalists that have been besieged by rebel groups. What's the situation on the ground in those towns like?
The reports we're hearing are quite similar. There's absence and lack of medical supplies, very limited food supplies, very limited electricity, and even water in some areas is hard to access. It's incredibly disappointing and distressing, not only because of the broken commitments to allowing aid into besieged areas, not only because it violates international humanitarian law, but also because it's a show of extreme bad faith in the lead up to what is supposed to be a peace process. This does not bode well.
You mentioned the peace talks, this not boding well for peace talks, the latest atrocities. Do you think there is an alternative that the international community hasn't yet explored, which could bring this conflict, if not to a close, then at least do something about these vicious war crimes that we're seeing on the ground?
Well, I think the peace process right now in the current circumstances is probably the best option in terms of what everyone seems to be focused on. What absolutely has to stop is the killing of civilians and the destruction of all of Syria's infrastructure. And I think some kind of a peace process is the only way to achieve that. It's extremely disturbing that the momentum has been knocked off its very fragile position with the recent skirmishes between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And yet again, it is the Syrian people who are going to pay the price for these regional power dynamics.
You mentioned regional power dynamics in Saudi Arabia and Iran. Earlier on in the show, I was speaking to a prominent Saudi commentator and a former Iranian official who were both attacking each other's human rights abuses. I just want to get your take as a long-standing observer and expert on the region. Let me just start with Saudi Arabia. Do you accept the Saudi argument that beheaded Shia cleric Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr wasn't a political prisoner, but was rather a violent dissident calling for regime change in Riyadh, and that's why they executed him alongside members of Al-Qaeda? That's what they say.
Well, there's certainly nothing in the evidentiary record to suggest that the Saudi argument is correct. Everything we know about Sheikh Nimr, even the charges against him were not of the sort to allege that he actually carried out violent attacks. I think the only violence-related charge against him was resisting arrest or some such allegation. But he was also clearly charged with crimes having to do with his political opinions and his political statements. Sheikh Nimr had himself disavowed violence and made very clear that he thought the best way to achieve an end to the discrimination against the Shia community in Saudi Arabia was through peaceful advocacy. So
why, in your view, do you think the Saudi authorities executed a person you're basically describing as a political prisoner?
Well, I think that's a question that's better directed for the Saudi Arabians. Clearly, it was a disastrous move on their part, since it will neither quell the appropriate and legitimate demands of the Shia population in Saudi Arabia for an end to the discrimination against it, nor does it help the region in the extent to which it has stoked tensions with Iran at a very delicate and fragile time when all hands are needed on deck to deal with the problem in Syria. So it was a really unwise move, both domestically, regionally, and globally.
And when you hear Iranians condemning Saudi executions as a violation of international law and human rights, what's your response to them?
It would be laughable if it wasn't so sad and cynical, given the fact that Iran's death penalty and execution rate is by far the worst in the entire region, and the arbitrary arrests and executions in Iran is rightly disturbing in its own regard. We have documented dozens and dozens of cases of prisoners sentenced to death in Iran without any modicum of a fair trial, and of course the very numbers of people executed, the vast majority of whom we believe to be drug offenders, are not crimes for which people should have been executed or sentenced to death in the first place.
Out of interest, and you're the expert here, of these two countries, which do you think has the worst human rights record?
Well, we don't even rank, we don't really rank countries vis-a-vis each other. I think I can fairly say that they're very much neck and neck in close competition, but the extent to which they disrespect and disregard the rights and freedoms of their own citizens. Obviously, Iran has some elements of democratic government. There is at least a process in which the international community doesn't necessarily know who the winner is going to be in the Iranian electoral process, but there is no form of democratic representation other than weak, toothless municipal councils that have sporadic elections in Saudi Arabia.
Sarah Leah Whitson, thanks so much for joining me.
You're very welcome.
That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.